A teenager helped an elderly man fix his broken car on the side of the road. He didn't accept the money offered, only a thank you. The next day, when he looked out the window, he saw something that made his mother cry with emotion. Deshawn's sneakers scraped against the pavement as he made his way home. He was used to this route by now, right past the line of glittering car dealerships on Main Street. The sun hung low, bouncing off the hoods of those imported cars, giving them a polished glow. That seemed almost unreal. He paused for a second, letting his gaze fall over the gleaming rows of Mercedes and BMWs, imagining himself behind the wheel. It was a stupid thought, but he couldn't help it. A dark, blue BMW caught his eye that afternoon. He stopped for a second longer, staring at its sleek lines, thinking about what it would be like to own something like that. One day he wanted that kind of future, like something different from the one that seemed laid out in front of him. Small jobs, struggling, barely keeping his head above water. "Hey, move it along, kid," a gruff voice barked. Deshawn blinked, startled as a security guard approached him. The guy was broad, older, wearing a cap low over his eyes, and it was clear he didn't like Deshawn being there. The guard's eyes were narrowed, sizing him up, the distrust. Obvious, Deshawn mumbled an apology and turned away. He picked up his pace, feeling his chest tighten. He shouldn't have stopped. He should have known better. This wasn't the first time he felt those eyes on him. People. Judging, assuming, he stuffed his hands deeper into his pockets and kept walking, not looking back. The route shifted from the dealership line, stretched to a more familiar street of modest houses. The lawns weren't as neatly trimmed, the cars older, some with dents or faded paint, a different world from the shiny ones he just left behind. Finally, he reached his house, a small worn-out place that stood at the edge of the block. Paint was peeling near the windows, but it was home. He opened the door, the hinges creaking, the living room was cramped. A few old photos lining the walls, his dad's face smiled down at him from one of the frames, an image that felt frozen in time next to the photos. His father's old tools hung in neat rows, a reminder of the garage that used to be busy. Before the accident, Deshawn swallowed hard eyes, lingering there for a moment longer before he headed into the kitchen. His mom was already home, slumped at the small kitchen table with a pile of bills in front of her. She looked up when she heard him trying to smile, but Deshawn could see the tiredness in her eyes. She worked double shifts, split between a diner and cleaning jobs, and even that barely kept them going. "Hey, Dee." She said, her voice a little too cheerful. "How was school?" "It was all right." He shrugged, moving to the fridge. He opened it, peering inside. Even though he knew there wasn't much. "You good, Mom?" She waved her hand like she was brushing off a fly. Same old, same old. She said, but her eyes fell to the stack of bills. "Got a notice from the landlord today. They well? They want the rent by the end of the month? Or they're saying eviction?" She tried to keep her voice casual, but it wavered just a bit. Deshawn closed the fridge and turned, leaning back against it. He didn't know what to say. It wasn't like this was the first time they were late, but the idea of losing the house, it made his chest tighten all over again. He had to do something. There was no way they could let this place go, not with everything his dad had built still sitting there. "Don't worry, Mom," he said, trying to make his voice sound steady. "I'll find something, another job or something," she smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I know you will, Dee. You're a good kid." She reached over and gave his arm a squeeze before going back to the bills. Her brow furrowed in concentration later in his small room. Deshawn sat on the floor next to the old toolbox. He ran his fingers over the metal latches, feeling the chill of it. His dad used to say it wasn't just about fixing things. It was about understanding them, finding the broken part, figuring out how it all worked together. That's what made his dad so good, and that's what Deshawn wanted to. He wanted to be good enough to fix things, to make something of himself, even if it seemed impossible. Most of the time, he heard his mom turn on the TV in the living room. The sound of a sitcom laugh track filtered into his room. He sighed, pulling open the toolbox. The creak of metal hinges, filling the silence inside, everything was still in place. The wrenches, the screwdrivers, even the small, magnifying glass his dad used for delicate work. It was all he had left of him. He spent the next hour tinkering with an old bike chain, trying to distract himself from the notice his mom had mentioned, trying to keep his mind off the dealership, off the guard's face, off the shiny cars that seemed like they belonged in a whole other world. He ended up staying up later than he meant to, the chain lying in pieces beside him on the floor. When he finally lay back on his thin mattress staring at the ceiling, he thought about how things could be different if he had a real job, real skills. Maybe they wouldn't be in this situation. Maybe he could fix more than just a broken chain. But he didn't know how to get from here to there. It felt like there was this big gap, and he didn't know how to cross it. But he had to try. He had to find a way. The next day, he walked to school. As usual, it was another cool morning, leaves crunching under his sneakers as he moved quickly down the street. He passed the dealerships again, but this time he kept his head down. Not looking, he didn't need the reminder. Instead, he turned off early, cutting through a back road that led closer to the school. The route was quieter, lined with older trees, the kind of path that didn't draw much attention. He was almost at the corner when he spotted a car, a silver Mercedes-Benz sitting by the roadside. The hood was popped, steam curling out from beneath it, and an older man in a sharp suit stood nearby, around pulling at his features. Deshaun paused. Something in him said to just keep moving. It wasn't his problem. He didn't need more people looking at him like he didn't belong. But then the man looked up, their eyes met for a split second, and Deshaun saw the frustration there, the uncertainty. He hesitated then, almost before he knew what he was doing. He crossed the street, making his way toward the car. "Hey, need some help?" Deshaun asked, voice a little shaky. The man looked at him, eyebrows raised. His tone was skeptical, his eyes glancing at Deshaun's worn sneakers and the old backpack slung over his shoulder. Deshaun nodded, swallowing down his nerves. "I know a bit about cars. I could take a look." The man, still looking unsure, sighed. "Well, it's not like. I have many other options right now," he muttered, stepping aside. "Go ahead." Deshaun dropped his bag and stepped closer, peering under the hood. His eyes ran over the engine, the wiring, the radiator. He knew enough to see what was going on here. An overheating problem, probably the water pump. He glanced back at the man, whose expression was somewhere between hopeful and doubtful. "This might take a minute," Deshaun said, already reaching into his bag for his wrench. The man just nodded, crossing his arms. As he watched, Deshaun got to work, the tools feeling steady in his hands. It wasn't much, but it was something he could do, a way to help, even if it was just for a stranger on the side of the road. Deshaun leaned over the engine, his hands moving with familiarity as if the parts were pieces of a puzzle he'd solved 100 times. Before, the old Mercedes was a classic, the kind of car his dad used to admire. He let out a breath, steadying himself, and started loosening a few bolts to get a better look. Mr. Thompson Desa had learned his name from the grumbled. Introduction stood a few feet away, his arms crossed, watching with narrowed eyes. He was well-dressed, his suit crisp, and his shoes shined. He didn't seem like the kind of guy who'd be used to being stuck on the side of the road. Deshaun figured. It must have been a rough day for him already. "How old are you, kid?" Mr. Thompson asked, his voice carrying that same skepticism. 14, Deshaun answered, not looking up, his focus on the engine. He spotted a loose hose, probably a leak that led to the overheating. He grabbed a rag from his bag and wiped his hands. Mr. Thompson raised an eyebrow. "You don't seem like a mechanic." Deshaun couldn't help but give a short laugh. "I'm not, sir, just learned some stuff from my dad. He used to be one." He hesitated, then added, "Worked in his own shop, actually used to." "Let me help," Mr. Thompson grunted. Not quite convinced, but not dismissing him outright either. "And you think you can fix this?" Deshawn nodded. "I mean, I can try. It looks like it might be overheating because of a loose connection here." He pointed to the hose, then gave it a gentle tug. "See? This needs to be tightened up, and I think your coolant leaking." Mr. Thompson squinted, stepping closer, looking where Deshawn was pointing H. He muttered, he took a deep breath, then let it out slowly, his tension almost palpable. "All right, go ahead. Do what you need." As Deshawn adjusted the connection, a small group of people walked by on the sidewalk across the street. He heard them laughing, then a voice. A man saying something about a kid working on a rich guy's car. Deshawn tried not to pay attention, focusing on the hose, but he could feel the heat rising in his neck. His ears burning, he kept his head down, tightening the clamps, making sure the hose was secure. He wasn't going to let those voices mess with him. He knew what he was doing, or at least he hoped he did. Does this happen? Often Mr. Thompson asked, his eyes flicking up toward the group that had just walked past, people commenting. Deshawn shrugged. Sometimes he looked up, meeting Mr. Thompson's gaze for just a second before looking back at the engine. "It's no big deal." Mr. Thompson frowned like he wanted to say something more, but he kept quiet. Instead, he took a step back, giving Deshawn space to work all right. Deshawn said, after another few minutes wiping his forehead with his sleeve. He could feel sweat starting to gather there, the pressure of Mr. Thompson's eyes still on him. "Try turning it on now." Mr. Thompson moved around to the driver's side and got in the engine. Sputtered for a moment, then fell silent. Deshawn winced, feeling his chest tighten. "Give it another go," Deshawn said, trying to keep his voice steady. Mr. Thompson twisted the key again. This time the engine came to life, the low rumble vibrating through the car. Deshawn let out a breath. He didn't realize he'd been holding. "Seems like it's running," Mr. Thompson said, sounding almost surprised. He stepped out of the car, shutting the door behind him, and looked at Deshawn. "Not bad, kid." Deshawn couldn't help the smile that pulled at his lips. "Thanks. It should hold up for a bit, but you might want to take it to a shop to get it checked, for leaks could be more under the hood that I can't see right now." Mr. Thompson nodded slowly. "I'll do that." He paused, then reached into his suit pocket, pulling out his wallet. He opened it, thumbing through some bills before pulling out a crisp $50 note. He held it out to Deshawn. "Here for your help." Deshawn looked at the bill, then at Mr. Thompson. He could see the genuine gratitude on the man's face, but he shook his head, stepping back. "No, it's all right. You don't need to pay me." He tried to make his voice firm, even though his hands were shaking a little. "I just wanted to help." Mr. Thompson frowned, his arms still outstretched. "Are you sure it's a fair payment for your time?" Deshawn shook his head again, feeling a strange mix of pride and nerves. "My dad always said you help people. When you can, no charge. Just good to do the right thing." Mr. Thompson slowly lowered the bill, his expression shifting from surprise to something else, something softer, maybe respect. He put the money back in his wallet and pulled out a small, sleek business card. Instead, he held it out, and this time Deshawn took it well. "In that case, if you ever need anything, any kind of opportunity, you give me a call." Mr. Thompson said, his tone serious. "I own a few dealerships and repair shops. Could use someone with the kind of heart you've got." Deshawn stared at the card, the glossy lettering standing out against the white background. "Thanks," he said quietly, slipping it into his pocket. He didn't know what else to say. Mr. Thompson gave him a nod, then got back into the Mercedes. "Take care, kid, and tell your dad." He raised a good one. Deshawn blinked, feeling a sudden weight on his chest. He swallowed hard, giving Mr. Thompson a tight smile. "Thanks, sir." "You too." The car pulled away from the curb, leaving Deshawn standing there, his bag slung over his shoulder, the tools still on the ground. Beside him, He watched until the car turned the corner, the taillights disappearing from view. He bent down, picking up his wrench and stuffed it back in his bag. He could feel his pulse in his fingertips, still buzzing from everything that had just happened. He had actually done it, actually fixed a car like that. And not just any car, a Mercedes. The kind of car that only people with real money drove. He zipped up his bag, straightening up and glancing back toward the direction of the dealership strip. Maybe it wasn't as far away as he thought. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way to get from here to there, even if he had to take it slow. The sun was lower now the evening, starting to stretch over the neighborhood. Deshawn adjusted the strap on his shoulder and started back toward home, his footsteps feeling a little lighter. He didn't know what was going to come of today, but it felt like something had shifted, like he was one step closer to something more, something better. And that was enough. For now, the next day, Deshawn was back at school. His head half in the classroom and half out in the world. He kept thinking about Mr. Thompson and that shiny Mercedes. He couldn't shake the feeling that something big had just happened. He didn't talk about it much, but he held onto that business card like it was made of gold at lunch. He sat with his friends in the cafeteria, a noisy space where everyone was either talking or yelling, the sound bouncing off the old tiled floors and walls. His friend Malik leaned over, peering at Deshawn with a grin. "Man, what's up with you today? You look like you're somewhere else." Malik nudged him with an elbow. "You still thinking about that rusty bike you were trying to fix yesterday?" Deshawn smiled, shaking his head. "Nah, man. Something different. Just, I helped this guy with a car yesterday. He said he didn't mention the specifics. Something about the way Malik would laugh about it made him want to keep it private. For now." "Oh yeah," Malik raised an eyebrow. "Was it one of those bust old Camry you always see on the side of the road?" "No, actually it was a Mercedes Dasa." Looked down, fiddling with the string on his hoodie, classic, like a real nice one. Mick stared at him, eyes widening. "A Mercedes, bro? You serious? And they actually let you touch it?" He laughed, shaking his head. "You're wild, yeah." "Well, the guy didn't have much of a choice," Deshawn said, shrugging. He gave a small smile. "It wasn't a big deal, just tightened some stuff up, got it running." "Easy, really." Malik gave him a look somewhere between disbelief and a grin. All right, Mr. Mechanic. Just don't forget us little people when you're fixing Lamborghinis or something." Deshawn laughed, but the idea stuck with him the rest of the day. Maybe one day right after school, Deshawn was on his usual route home. His feet moved over the cracked sidewalk, the air crisp, and his hands were deep in his pockets. He thought about taking the long route again past the dealerships, but something made him hesitate. He didn't want to see that security guard, didn't want the judgmental eyes following him, not today. Instead, he took the same shortcut as before, down the quieter streets. He was almost to the corner when he saw them, two guys, maybe a few years older than him, standing next to a parked car. The hood was up, and they were leaning over it, talking to each other in low voices. One of them glanced up at Deshawn. As he approached, "Hey, yo kid," the guy called out, waving him over. Deshawn stopped, his heart skipping a beat. He could tell from the way the guy called him that it wasn't going to be friendly. He turned his head, pretending he hadn't heard, ready to keep moving, but the guy stepped away from the car, moving toward him. "Hey, I'm talking to you," the guy shouted, his voice louder now. "Come here for a second." Deshawn clenched his jaw. Turning slowly, the guy was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a beat-up leather jacket. His friend stayed by the car, a smirk on his face. "What?" Deshawn asked, trying to keep his voice steady. He didn't want trouble, especially not now. "You know anything about cars?" the guy asked, pointing back at the open hood. "We got a problem here, and you look like you might be able to help." Deshawn frowned, glancing at the car. It was an older model, probably from the early 2000s. He could see a lot of corrosion on the battery terminals, which might have been the issue, but something about the way the guy was talking to him made him uneasy. I mean, maybe Deshawn said cautiously, "What's the problem?" The guy's grin widened and he took another step closer. "Oh, so you do know something?" he said, nodding. He looked over his shoulder at his friend, who chuckled. "Why? Don't you come take a look?" "Huh, do a favor for us." Deshawn glanced at the friend, then back at the guy in front of him. His gut was telling him to walk away, but his pride was telling him to show these guys. He wasn't scared. He bit his lip, stepping a little closer. "His eyes on the engine looks like your batteries, corroded," Deshawn said, pointing at it. "You probably need to clean the terminals or replace it altogether." The guy cut him off his smile, dropping, Yeah, whatever." "How about you actually do it?" Instead of just talking, he moved to grab Diz's shoulder, shoving him toward the car. Deshawn stumbled, his heart pounding. Now he took a step back, shaking his head. "Man, I don't have time for this." "Oh, come on," the guy said, his tone shifting, mocking. "Now thought you were some kind of mechanic. Don't tell me. You're scared." Deshawn's hands clenched into fist, but he forced himself to stay calm. He wasn't about to get into a fight over this. Not here, not with two guys who clearly wanted to make trouble. He took a deep breath, shaking his head. "I'm not scared. I got somewhere to be," he said, his voice firm. "You need help. Take it to a shop." The friend by the car laughed, pushing himself away from the hood. "Yeah, that's what I thought. Little kid thinks he's a big shot, 'cause he can point at a battery." The words stung, but Deshawn turned, walking away as fast as he could without running. He could hear them behind him, their laughter echoing down the street, but he kept his eyes forward. Not looking back, his chest felt tight, his stomach in knots, but he wasn't gonna let them see that he made it to the next corner. Turning quickly, putting distance between him and the two guys, he stopped for a second, leaning against a fence, trying to catch his breath. "Idiots," he muttered to himself, wiping his face with his sleeve. His hands were shaking, and he hated it. Hated that they got to him like that. He knew he shouldn't have stopped. He knew it from the second the guy called out to him, but he still felt like he'd failed. Somehow, like he'd let them win. He hated that feeling more than anything. After a minute, he straightened up, adjusting his backpack. He needed to get home. His mom would be getting off her shift soon, and he didn't want her to see him like this, angry, shaken up. He started walking again, his feet moving faster, the tension in his shoulders slowly easing as the neighborhood grew quieter around him. By the time he got home, the sun was starting to set the sky. Turning a deep orange, he pushed open the door, dropping his bag by the entrance. His mom was already in the kitchen, the smell of something cooking filling the small house. "Hey, Dee," she called over her shoulder, her voice bright. "How was school today?" Deshawn forced a smile, walking into the kitchen. "It was all right," he said, moving to the fridge to grab a soda. "Just same old stuff." You know, his mom looked over at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You sure you look a little off today?" Deshawn shrugged, cracking open the soda, just tired. I guess he didn't want to worry her. She already had enough on her plate. "Did they give you any trouble at the diner today?" his mom sighed. Turning back to stir the pot on the stove. "Nothing I can't handle," she said, her voice light. "But weary just got to keep moving, right?" Deshawn nodded, leaning against the counter. He took a sip of his soda, the cold fizz, helping calm his nerves. He glanced at the old toolbox in the corner of the room, the one his dad used to carry everywhere. It was beat up and worn, but it held everything Deshawn needed. Maybe tomorrow would be better. Maybe tomorrow he'd figure something else out, something that didn't involve jerks. Trying to push him around? Yeah, just got to keep moving. He repeated more to himself than to his mom. The next day felt different for Deshawn. There was an edge to the air, like something important was just around the corner. He couldn't shake the feeling. He walked to school as usual, his backpack bouncing lightly. On his back, his hands stuffed deep into his hoodie pockets. It was chilly, the kind of cool that cut through his thin clothes. He made it to school, sat through classes, and half listened as teachers droned on about equations and reading assignments. His mind kept wandering, like it was stuck between two gears. When the final bell rang, Deshaun headed out of the building, ready to make his way home, hopingly, for an uneventful walk this time. But when he turned the corner onto the quieter street, he saw something that made him stop short. There was another car pulled over at the curb, a sleek silver Mercedes-Benz. This time, a newer model and a man standing beside it. Looking frustrated, it took Deshaun a second, but he realized. It was Mr. Thompson again. The guy was pacing back and forth, his phone to his ear, but he looked like he wasn't having any luck. Deshaun swallowed, a mix of nerves and curiosity bubbling up inside him. He wasn't sure if he should go over or not. He could just keep walking. Mr. Thompson probably didn't even remember him. But then Mr. Thompson glanced up, their eyes meeting for a split second, and the recognition was instant. "Hey you," Mr. Thompson called, waving Deshaun over. He looked relieved, and he ended his phone call abruptly. "You're that kid, right? The one from the other day?" Deshaun blinked, hesitating for just a moment before he started walking over. "Yeah?" "That was me," he said, giving a small nod. "What's going on? Car trouble again?" Mr. Thompson let out a frustrated sigh, shaking his head. "Yeah, and I've got no idea what's wrong with it. This time, been trying to call a tow, but they're all backed up. I don't have time for this. I've got a meeting. I'm already late for her." He gestured to the car, then paused, looking at Dessa with a hint of desperation. "Think you could take a look again?" Deshaun took a deep breath, nodding slowly. He could feel that familiar nod of nerves in his stomach, but he ignored it. "Sure, I can try," he said, slipping his bag off his shoulder and setting it on the sidewalk. "Thank you," Mr. Thompson said, letting out a sigh that sounded half relieved. Half anxious, he stepped back, giving Deshaun space. Deshaun opened the hood, the smell of gasoline and overheated metal hitting his nose. He scanned the engine, his eyes moving over the parts, trying to spot anything obvious. Mr. Thompson stood beside him, tapping his foot, glancing at his watch. "Every few seconds got a big meeting today?" Deshaun asked, trying to make conversation as he worked. Mr. Thompson nodded. "Yeah, council meeting, got investors coming in from out of town. This is the last thing I needed today." He paused, then added almost as an afterthought, "Not that I'm ungrateful you helping is, well, it's more than I could have hoped for." Deshaun just nodded, his focus narrowing in on a loose connection near the radiator. He reached into his bag, pulling out a wrench and started tightening it up. His hands were steady. Despite the pressure, he could hear Mr. Thompson pacing again, and the sound made his chest feel tight. He needed to get this right to prove to himself and maybe to Mr. Thompson that he could handle it all right. "I think I see what's wrong," Deshaun said. After a few more minutes, straightening up, he wiped his hands on his jeans, leaving dark smudges behind. "Go ahead and try starting it." Mr. Thompson moved quickly to the driver's side, slipping in and twisting the key. The engine groaned, trying to turn over, but then sputtered and went silent again. Deshaun felt his stomach drop. He frowned, leaning over the engine again, scanning the parts. There had to be something he missed. He couldn't just let it end like this, not after Mr. Thompson had trusted him. "Try it again," Deshaun said, his voice more forceful. This time, as if he could will the car to start, Mr. Thompson did, but the result was the same. A few weak turns, then nothing. Deshaun took a deep breath, his hands running over the parts, his mind racing. The pressure was building. Now he could feel Mr. Thompson watching him, waiting, and the frustration on his face was clear. This was supposed to be something. Deshaun was good at something he could do to make things right, even if it was just for a stranger. He thought about his dad about the times. They'd worked on engines together. His dad always told him that it wasn't about the fancy tools. It was about understanding what the car needed, finding the source of the problem and tackling it. Head-on, Deshaun closed his eyes for a second, took a deep breath, then leaned in closer. It had to be the ignition. He could feel it in his gut. Something instinctive. He reached down, adjusting a wire, feeling the snap of it clicking back into place. He straightened up, wiping his hands again, and nodded. "Try it one more time," he said, stepping back, his heart pounding. Mr. Thompson turned the key this time. The engine rode to life, the rumble filling the quiet street. Deshaun felt a rush of relief wash over him, a smile breaking across his face before he could stop it. "Yes," Mr. Thompson shouted, his hand hitting the steering wheel. He leaned out the window, looking at Deshaun with something that almost looked like pride. "You did it, kid. You actually did it." Deshaun grinned, nodding. "Told you. I knew what I was doing," he said, his voice light. Mr. Thompson turned off the car, stepping out and coming around the front. He looked at Deshaun for a long moment, then shook his head, chuckling. "I don't know how you do it, but you've got a real talent." "You know that?" Deshaun shrugged, feeling his face flush. I learned a lot from my dad," he said quietly. "He taught me everything." "I know," Mr. Thompson smiled, then reached into his pocket. Pulling out a small, sleek checkbook, he flipped it open, scribbling something down quickly, then ripped out the check, holding it out to Deshaun. "Here. Take it. I know you said no to the cash last time, but this is more than just a thank you," he said, his voice serious. Deshaun stared at the check, then at Mr. Thompson. He shook his head slowly, his hands still at his sides. I can't take that," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't do it for money." Mr. Thompson frowned, his hand still outstretched. "Listen, it's not about the money. It's about recognizing your worth. You've got a real skill, and I want to make sure you know that." Deshaun hesitated, then slowly reached out, taking the check. He glanced down at it. $200. His eyes widened, and he looked back up at Mr. Thompson. "This is a lot," he said, his voice shaky. Mr. Thompson nodded. "And it's worth every penny. You saved me today, kid. You don't know how much that means." Deshaun swallowed, then nodded, slipping the check into his pocket. "Thank you," he said, his voice still quiet. "I really appreciate it." Mr. Thompson smiled, then reached out, clapping Deshaun on the shoulder. "You keep this up and you're going to do big things. I know it." Deshaun felt a swell of pride in his chest, and he nodded again. "I hope so," he said. Mr. Thompson gave him a nod, then moved back to the car. He got in, started the engine, and waved as he pulled away, the car disappearing down the street. Deshaun stood there for a moment, his heart still pounding, the check feeling heavy in his pocket. He took a deep breath, then picked up his bag, slinging it over his shoulder. He turned, heading back toward home, his steps feeling lighter than they had in days. Maybe, just maybe, things were starting to change. Deshaun walked home with his hands deep in his pockets, his fingers brushing against the edges of the crisp check from Mr. Thompson. He felt a strange mixture of excitement and discomfort. The idea of having $200 in his pocket was surreal. It was enough to help his mom with the rent, maybe enough to ease the stress for a while, but he couldn't shake the thought that he hadn't done it for the money, and taking it almost felt like he was betraying something in himself, something his dad would have wanted him to remember. He stepped into the house, hearing his mom moving around in the kitchen. She was humming a soft tune, the kind she always hummed when she was trying to distract herself from whatever stress was piling up that day. Deshaun slipped out of his sneakers and headed toward the kitchen. "Hey, Mom," he said, trying to keep his tone light. His mom looked up from the counter, a smile spreading across her face. "Hey, Dee. How was school today?" She put down the knife she was using to chop vegetables and gave him her full attention. Deshaun shrugged, trying to play it casual. Same old. Same old, got some homework to do later, but I helped that guy again today, the one from the other day with the car. Her eyebrows lifted, her expression brightening. "You helped that nice man again. What happened this time?" Deshaun leaned against the doorway, pulling the check from his pocket and looking at it for a moment before showing it to her. Yeah, he broke down again. I got it running and he gave me this. His mom's eyes widened when she saw the amount. She reached for the check, her fingers brushing over the number, her mouth opening slightly. In surprise, $200 D. This is a lot. She looked up at him, her expression a mix of pride and something else, something cautious. Did you take it? Deshaun hesitated, biting his lip. I mean, yeah, but I didn't really want to. He insisted, said it wasn't just about the car, that it was about recognizing my worth or something like that. His mom nodded slowly, her eyes softening. She handed the check back to him. You did good, Dee. You helped someone. That's what matters. She paused, her voice lowering. But you should know it's okay to accept something in return, too. You're worth it. Your time, your skills, they're worth something. Deshaun looked down at the check again, feeling the weight of her words. It still felt strange, like it didn't quite fit him, but maybe his mom was right. Maybe he had earned it in his own way. Yeah, I guess he said, tucking the check back into his pocket. He tried to smile, though it felt a little unsure. I just wanted to help. You know, didn't want it to be about money. His mom smiled, nodding, and that's exactly why you deserve it. You have a good heart, Dee. Your dad would be proud. Her words hit him hard in a good way. Deshaun swallowed the tightness in his chest. Easing a bit, he nodded, giving her a small smile. Thanks. Mom, she reached over, ruffling his hair, and he ducked away with a grin. Now go, get cleaned up. Dinner will be ready soon. Deshaun headed to his room. The check still in his hand and dropped onto his bed, he stared at the ceiling, thinking about everything that had happened, the tension, the doubt, the relief when the engine had finally roared to life, and then Mr. Thompson's words telling him he had real talent. It felt good, better than he wanted to admit. He glanced over at the photo of his dad, the one that hung next to his old toolbox. His dad's smile looked back at him, and Deshaun felt a swell of determination. He had a long way to go, but maybe he was on the right path. The next morning, Deshaun woke up, the sun barely peeking. Through the blinds, he got dressed quickly, slipping the check into his back pocket. He had an idea. He'd thought about it all night, and now he was ready to do it. He wanted to put the money to good use, not just let it sit in his pocket. Hey, Mom, he called as he came into the kitchen. She was already up, sipping her coffee and reading through a few bills that were spread out on the table. She looked up, raising an eyebrow morning day. What's got you up so early? Deshaun hesitated, his hand resting on the back of one of the kitchen chairs. I was thinking we could use this for the rent, right? I mean, it would help, wouldn't it? His mom blinked, her eyes softening. She put her coffee down, shaking her head gently. Dee, that's your money. You earned it. You should use it for something you need. Don't worry about the rent. I'll figure it out. Deshaun felt his throat tighten. He knew she meant well, but he also knew how much she was struggling. He didn't want to just sit by and watch her stress over it. He wanted to do something, anything that could make it easier. But Mom, he started, but she held up her hand, her smile, gentle but firm. No buts, Dee. It's yours. I want you to keep it. Maybe save it for something special. She reached across the table, her fingers brushing his wrist. Trust me. Okay, we're going to be all right. Deshaun looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. He didn't like it, didn't like feeling like he couldn't help, but he could see how important it was to her. She wanted him to have something for himself, and he couldn't argue with that. All right, he said, slipping the check back into his pocket. But if you need anything at all, you'll tell me, right? She smiled, her eyes glistening slightly, of course. Dee, always that afternoon, Deshaun walked over to the bike repair shop. That was just a few blocks from his school. He'd passed by it 100 times, always peering in through the window, wishing he could work there. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small garage where old bikes hung from the ceiling. the floor littered with spare parts, but to Deshaun, it was like a gold mine, a place where he could learn more, do more. He stepped inside the bell above the door, jingling as he pushed it open. The smell of oil and rubber hit him immediately, and he felt a strange sense of excitement. The shop owner, a man in his 50s with a scruffy beard and a baseball cap, looked up from behind the counter. "Help you with something, kid?" He asked, his voice rough but not unkind. Deshaun took a deep breath, stepping up to the counter. "Actually, I was wondering if you were hiring. I know a bit about bikes, and I could really use a job." The owner looked him up and down, then gave a short laugh. You know about bikes, huh? How old are you, 14? Deshaun said, his voice steady. He pulled the check from his pocket, placing it on the counter. "I just fixed a Mercedes, the other day twice actually, and the guy paid me this." He pointed at the amount, so I'm not just talking. The owner's eyebrows lifted, and he let out a low whistle. "A Mercedes, huh? And you're only 14. He leaned back, scratching his beard. "You got some guts, kid. I'll give you that." Deshaun swallowed, nodding. I want to learn more. I want to work. I'll do anything, sweep the floors, clean up. I don't need much, just a chance." The owner was quiet for a moment. Then he let out a sigh. All right, I could use an extra pair of hands around here, but I'm not promising anything fancy. You'll start with the basics, and if you prove yourself, maybe I'll let you work on a few bikes. Deshaun's heart leaped, a smile spreading across his face. "Yes, sir. That's all I need, thank you." The owner gave him a small grin, then nodded toward the back of the shop. "Come by after school tomorrow." "All right, we'll see what you got." Deshaun nodded, the excitement bubbling up inside him. "Yes, sir, I'll be here." As he left the shop, the bell jingling behind him, he felt a strange sense of hope. Maybe things were starting to look up. Maybe this was the beginning of something bigger. He walked home, the check still in his pocket, a new sense of purpose. In his step, he had a job now, maybe not the biggest, but it was something, and he was going to prove himself just like he'd done with Mr. Thompson's car, one step at a time. He was going to make things happen. The next morning started just like any other. Deshaun got out of bed, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. He pulled on his clothes, lacing up his worn sneakers. He took a quick glance in the mirror, smoothing down his hair before heading out to the kitchen. His mom was already up, pouring herself a cup of coffee. She smiled when she saw him. "Morning, Dee," she said, her voice gentle. "You ready for school today?" "Yeah," Deshaun mumbled, though he felt something different, something like anticipation. Today was the day he was supposed to start at the bike shop after school. The thought kept bouncing around in his head, making him feel like something big was about to happen. He grabbed a piece of toast, munching on it as he grabbed his bag. From beside the door, "See you later, Mom," he said, his voice muffled by the bread in his mouth. "Have a good day. Remember, you've got this," she said, her smile warm as she waved him off. He walked to school with his usual determination, his sneakers scuffing the pavement. But halfway through the morning, he found it hard to concentrate. His teachers went on about algebra and history, and Deshaun just nodded along, his mind elsewhere. The day felt longer than usual, and when the final bell rang, he nearly jumped out of his seat, eager to get out. But just as he stepped outside of the school, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a message from his mom, Dee. "Come home right after school. There's someone here to see you." Deshaun's brow furrowed, his mind racing. Who could possibly be at his house? His mom didn't mention expecting anyone. His stomach tightened with curiosity and worry as he turned and started walking home, his pace picking up. As he approached his street, he noticed something unusual. A shiny black car parked out front. It didn't fit in with the rest of the neighborhood. It looked like it belonged somewhere more upscale, somewhere like Main Street, where the car dealership stood. When he got closer, he recognized the car. It was a luxury model, the kind you only see in showrooms or magazines. The Mercedes logo on the front glinted in the sunlight, and there standing right next to it was Mr. Thompson. He was talking to his mom on the front step, gesturing toward the car, a wide smile on his face. Deshaun slowed his walk, his eyes widening. He took in the scene for a moment before his mom noticed him. She waved, her face lighting up. "Dee, come over here." She called, her voice carrying across the small front lawn. Mr. Thompson turned, catching sight of Deshaun, and smiled broadly there. "He is the mechanic I was telling your mother about," he said, giving a nod in Deshaun's direction. Deshaun blinked his steps, hesitant as he approached. Hey, Mr. Thompson? What are you doing here?" He tried to sound calm, but his voice wavered a little. "This was unexpected, Mr. Thompson." In his neighborhood at his house, Mr. Thompson smiled, nodding toward the car. "Well, I had a little time today, and I thought I should come by to thank you properly. I wanted to talk to you about something important." Deshaun exchanged a glance with his mom. She was smiling, though her eyes were shining with unshed tears. She looked like she was holding her breath, waiting for something amazing to happen. Mr. Thompson took a step forward, gesturing toward the car. "Again, you see, Deshaun, I meant what I said about recognizing your worth. You've got talent, real talent, and you deserve an opportunity to develop it. I own several dealerships, as I mentioned, and I've also got a network of repair shops and workshops. We do restorations, repairs, high-end stuff, and well, I think you'd be a great fit." Deshaun's heart skipped a beat. He stared at Mr. Thompson, unsure if he'd heard him correctly. A fit? You mean like a job, not just any job?" Mr. Thompson said, his voice firm. "I want you to come in after school work as an apprentice in one of my shops. It's part-time, of course, so you can still focus on school, but I think this could be a great chance for you to learn more the way you worked on my car. The way you handled yourself, that shows me you've got what it takes." Deshaun blinked, stunned into silence. He looked over at his mom, who was nodding, her eyes full of pride. She stepped closer, putting her hand on his shoulder. "Day, this is an incredible opportunity. You've always wanted something like this." His throat felt tight, and he had to swallow a few times before he could speak. "But why me? I mean, I'm just a kid." "I don't know that much." "Much," Mr. Thompson smiled, shaking his head. "That's the thing. Deshaun, you may be young, but you know more than most, and more importantly, you've got the right attitude. You want to help. You want to learn. That's worth more than anything." Deshaun felt his chest swell, his heart pounding hard. He glanced down, trying to process everything that was happening. He thought about the bike shop job. He was supposed to start that afternoon. It had felt like a big step, but now this felt like something even bigger, something he dreamed of. "What do you say, Dee?" his mom asked softly, her voice thick with emotion. "Are you ready for this?" Deshaun looked up, meeting Mr. Thompson's eyes, then his mom's. He nodded slowly, the disbelief giving way to excitement. "Yeah," he said, his voice shaky but full of determination. "Yeah, I want to do it. I want to learn everything I can." Mr. Thompson's smile widened and he held out his hand. "That's what I like to hear, kid. You won't regret this." Deshaun reached out, shaking Mr. Thompson's hand, feeling the firm grip, the certainty in the older man's eyes. He could hardly believe this was real. It felt like he was standing on the edge of something big, like his life was about to change. In a way he hadn't dared to imagine. His mom let out a small laugh, her eyes shining. She wiped at them quickly, then pulled Deshaun into a hug. "I'm so proud of you, Dee. You're going to do amazing things. I know it." Deshaun hugged her back, feeling the warmth of her arms around him. He closed his eyes for a second, letting the moment wash over him, then pulled away, giving her a small smile. Mr. Thompson nodded. "All right, then I'll have my assistant get in touch with you about the details. We'll start next week. If that works for you, you can come by after school and we'll get you set up with everything you need." Deshaun nodded, his head still spinning. "Yeah, next week works." He looked at his mom, who was nodding along her smile, never faltering. Mr. Thompson gave them both one last nod, then turned back to the car. All right, then I'll see you soon. Disa, and remember, you've got something special. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. With that, he got into his car, giving them a final wave before pulling away, the sleek vehicle disappearing down. The street Deshawn stood there on the front step with his mom. The reality of what had just happened sinking in his mom turned to him, her voice. Softa, this is it. This is your chance to do something incredible. Your dad would be so proud. Deshawn felt his throat tighten, his eyes stinging. He looked down, his voice. Barely a whisper, I hope so, Mom. I really hope so. She put her arm around his shoulders, pulling him close. He would be, and so am I. Deshawn looked out at the street, the feeling of hope swelling in his chest. Maybe this was it. Maybe this was his way forward. The way to make something more of himself, something that mattered, and he was ready. The next week passed by in a blur. Deshawn was half nervous, half excited as each day brought him closer to his first shift at the auto shop. His mom helped him pick out the best clothes he had, work-appropriate stuff that wasn't too worn out, and they made sure everything was ready. He'd already called the bike shop to let them know he wouldn't be coming, and they had wished him good luck, understanding the opportunity he was getting. Finally, the day arrived. Deshawn felt a knot in his stomach as he stood outside the auto shop. Looking up at the big glass windows, this was the place, his shot at something real. It was larger than he imagined. Several cars were parked inside, and he could see a few mechanics walking around in blue uniforms. Talking and working, the sign above the entrance read, Thompson, Auto Restorations. Just seeing that made it feel official. He took a deep breath and pushed open the glass door. A bell chimed above his head and he stepped inside. The smell of oil, grease, and rubber was strong, but familiar and comforting in a way that settled his nerves a bit. He walked up to the front desk where a woman sat typing something on the computer. She glanced up smiling when she saw him. Hi there. You must be Deshawn, she said, her tone friendly. Deshawn nodded, giving her a small smile. Yes, ma'am. Mr. Thompson said I should come by after school today. I'm supposed to start, of course, welcome, she said, standing up and extending her hand. I'm Maria. I handle all the scheduling and front desk stuff. Mr. Thompson said to expect you. You're going to head back to Bay 3. All right, that's where you'll meet Vince. He's in charge back there, and he'll show you the ropes. Deshawn nodded, a nervous excitement buzzing under his skin. Thank you, Maria. Good luck, Kid Maria said, with a smile, nodding toward the garage door in the back. Just head on through. Deshawn walked toward the door, pushing it open and stepping into the large workspace. The noise hit him immediately. The sound of engines, clanking tools, and the faint crackle of a radio playing rock music. He glanced around, taking in the rows of cars, some up on lifts, others being worked on by mechanics in their uniforms. It felt like stepping into a new world one. He was desperate to be part of Hey You, the new kid. A voice called out, cutting through the noise. Deshawn turned, spotting a tall man with broad shoulders, a baseball cap pushed down low on his head. He was wiping his hands on a rag, eyeing Deshawn with a curious expression. Yeah, I'm Deshawn, he said, stepping closer. Mr. Thompson said I should come here to start today. The man grinned, nodding. I'm Vince. I run the show back here. You do what I say, and we'll get along just fine. Got it. Deshawn nodded quickly. Yes, Sir Vince, let out a short laugh. Don't call me sir, makes me feel old. Just Vince is fine. He gestured to a set of shelves against the wall, stacked with tools and supplies. All right. So before you get your hands dirty, I want you to understand where everything is. Wrenches, sockets, jacks, all the good stuff. It's all over there. Your job today is to keep this place tidy, make sure tools go back where they belong, and help out wherever you can. Deshawn nodded again, trying to keep up, as Vince led him through the shop, pointing out where different tools were kept, where spare parts were organized, and where all the cars came in. And out, he talked fast, and Deshawn did his best to remember everything. After the whirlwind tour, Vince stopped in front of a car, a classic Mustang that was up on a lift, its hood popped open. He looked down at Deshawn, his expression serious. "So you think you're ready to get your hands dirty?" Deshawn swallowed, nodding. "Yeah, I'm ready, Vince," smiled, tossing him a pair of work gloves. "Good answer. We're gonna start with something simple, oil change ever done." One before Deshawn shook his head. "No, but I've seen it done. I know the basics perfect. Let's see if you know as much as you think you do." Vince said, waving him over to the car. He crouched down, pointing under the vehicle. "All right, first things first, you gotta find the oil drain plug. You know where that is." Deshawn knelt down, peering under the car. He squinted, spotting the drain plug, and pointed there, right? Vince nodded, giving him an approving grin. "You got it. Now grab that wrench over there, and let's get this thing moving." Deshawn did, as he was told, grabbing the wrench and getting into position. He could feel Vince's eyes on him, and the pressure made his hands shake a little. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, and started loosening the plug. "Good. You're doing fine. Just keep going." Vince said, his voice encouraging. The oil's going to come out. Quick, so make sure you're ready with the pan." Deshawn nodded, positioning the pan just beneath the plug. He twisted the wrench, and suddenly the plug came loose and oil began to flow out. In a dark, steady stream, Deshawn watched it pour into the pan, his heart pounding a little, but there was something satisfying about it, like he was really doing it, really working on a car, just like he'd always wanted after the oil finished draining. Vince clapped him on the back. "Not bad, kid. Now let's get the filter swapped out. Ever done that before?" Deshawn shook his head, and Vince nodded, moving around to show him what to do. "No worries. I'll walk you through it. You pay attention, and you'll pick it up quick." They worked for the next couple of hours, Vince showing him different tasks and letting Deshawn try them out himself. Each time Deshawn managed to get something right, Vince would give him an approving nod or a quick pat on the shoulder. And every time Deshawn fumbled or struggled, Vince was patient, explaining things again until it made sense by the time the afternoon started. Turning into evening, Deshawn was covered in grease, his hands sore, but he felt a sense of pride that he hadn't felt in a long time. He was actually doing it working in a real shop with real mechanics. It felt like the start of something big. "All right, that's enough for today," Vince said, taking off his gloves and tossing them onto the workbench. "You did good, kid. You've got a lot to learn, but you're picking it up faster than most." Deshawn smiled, wiping the sweat from his forehead. "Thanks, Vince. I'm gonna keep working hard." "I promise." Vince nodded, his expression softening a bit. "I know you will just remember, nobody's perfect their first day. You mess up, you learn from it. You got it, yeah." "I got it," Dessa said, feeling a surge of determination. Vince gave him a small smile. "Good. Now go home. Get some rest tomorrow. We'll really put you to work." Deshawn nodded, pulling off his gloves and setting them down on the bench. He said goodbye to Vince and the other mechanics who gave him nods and a few encouraging words as he walked out of the shop. The evening air hit him cool against his face. He looked up at the sky, the sun just beginning to dip below the horizon. Casting everything in a warm orange glow, he felt tired, his muscles sore, but there was a sense of accomplishment that filled him up. He was doing it. He was taking the first steps towards something real, something that mattered. He couldn't wait to tell his mom about his first day when he got home. His mom was waiting for him, standing in the doorway with a bright smile. "How was it?" she asked, her eyes full of anticipation. Deshawn grinned, feeling the excitement bubble up inside him. Again, "It was amazing, Mom. I worked on a Mustang. Did an oil change, Vince. He's the guy in charge. He said I did good." She pulled him into a hug, her arms tight around him. I knew you would. I'm so proud of you. Deshawn hugged her back, feeling the warmth of her embrace. Thanks, Mom. I'm just getting started. But I feel like this. Is it like I'm? Finally, on the right path, she pulled back, looking at him with tears in her eyes. You are. You're exactly where you're meant to be. He nodded, smiling. Yeah, I think so too, as they walked inside. Deshawn felt a sense of hope. He hadn't felt in a long time. The future felt brighter now, like there was finally a way forward, a way to make his dreams come true. The following weeks were a blur of school in the auto shop. Deshawn fell into a routine, get up early, head to school, do his best to stay focused in class, and then rush over to the shop right after the final bell. It wasn't easy and it wasn't always fun, but it was something real, and that made all the hard parts worth it after a few days. Maria at the front desk greeted Deshawn with a friendly wave. Every time he walked in, Vince would always be there in the back, already working, and he'd give Deshawn a nod as soon as he stepped into the garage. Sometimes Vince would say something like, "Ready for another day of getting your hands dirty, kid," and Deshawn would grin, nodding. Most days were filled with basics: oil changes, tire rotations, replacing air filters. It wasn't glamorous, but it was good work, and Deshawn was learning fast. He liked the smell of the oil, the feel of the tools in his hands, and the way the cars seemed to come to life under his care. Every time Vince gave him a job to do, Deshawn took it seriously, making sure he understood everything he needed before. Diving in one particular Friday afternoon, Vince called Deshawn over while he was wiping down a set of tools. "Hey kid, come here." "A sec." Put down the rag, walking over to where Vince stood beside a beat-up old truck. He'd seen the truck in the back corner of the shop for a while. It looked like it hadn't run in years. "We got a real project on our hands," Vince said, nodding toward the truck. "Customer wants a full restoration frame off kind of job." "You interested?" Deshawn's eyes widened. A full restoration. That was serious work, more complicated than anything he'd ever done, but it was also an opportunity to learn even more. He felt a thrill of excitement at the challenge. "Yeah, I'm interested," he said, his voice steady. Vince smiled. "Good, we're going to start tearing it down today. I want you to help, but listen, this isn't like changing a tire, all right? You messed something up here. It's going to take us days to fix it. You ready for that kind of responsibility?" Deshawn nodded, swallowing hard. "I'm ready, all right." Then Vince said, handing him a ratchet set. "Let's get to work." They spent the next few hours taking apart the truck piece by piece. Vince showed Deshawn what to do, how to take out the seats, unbolt the panels, strip away everything down to the bare bones of the vehicle. It was slow work, and it required a lot of focus, but Deshawn loved it. Each bolt that came free, each panel that was carefully removed, felt like a step closer to something incredible. But balancing the shop and school wasn't easy. Deshawn was exhausted by the time he got home every night. His mom always had dinner ready, waiting for him at the small kitchen table. She would listen as he talked about his day, about what he learned about the cars and the mechanics and Vince. She always smiled, nodding along, but he could see the worry in her eyes. Sometimes the way she watched him when he was too tired to do more than push his food around his plate. "You're doing great, Dee," she said one night, her voice gentle, "but don't forget about your schoolwork. Okay, you need to keep your grades up if you want to keep working." There. Deshawn looked up his fork, pausing halfway to his mouth. He knew she was right. He'd been struggling to keep up with his homework, and he could feel himself slipping behind in a few subjects. The shop took up most of his time, and by the time he got home, he was too tired to concentrate on school, but he couldn't let himself fall behind. "Not now, I know, Mom," he said, sighing. "I'll try harder." She smiled, reaching over to squeeze his hand. "That's all I asked, to just do your best." The next day at school, Deshawn made an effort to stay focused. He listened to his teachers, took notes, and even asked a question during math class, something he never did. But it was hard. He kept thinking about the truck, about the restoration, about what he'd be working on after school. He could hardly wait to get back to the shop when the bell rang. He was out the door in a flash, heading straight for Thompson Auto Restorations. He walked in through the garage door, the familiar smell of oil and grease hitting him, and he felt a sense of calm wash over him. This was where he belonged. "Hey, Dee," Vince called, waving him over. "Got a fun one for you." Today, Deshaun grinned, dropping his backpack by the workbench and pulling on his gloves. "What's up? Got a customer who wants the brakes checked on this baby." Vince said, pointing to a sleek black Camaro, "Think you can handle it?" Deshaun nodded, his heart pounding with excitement. "Yeah, I got it." Vince handed him the inspection checklist. "Good, I'll be over with the truck. If you need me, take your time and be thorough." Deshaun set to work, jacking up the car and pulling off the wheels. He checked the rotors, the pads, the brake lines. Moving through each step carefully, the more he worked, the more comfortable he felt he could do this. He knew he could. He was just finishing up when Vince came over, glancing at the car and nodding. "Nice work, kid. Brakes look good. You're getting better." Deshaun smiled, feeling a swell of pride. "Thanks, Vince. Keep this up, and I might have to start paying you more," Vince said with a grin, clapping Deshaun on the shoulder. Deshaun's eyes widened. More money. The thought was almost overwhelming. He'd been happy just to be there, learning, doing the work. But the idea of earning more, it meant he could help his mom even more with the bills. Maybe make things a little easier for her. "I'd like that," Deshaun said, his voice a little shaky. "I'm going to keep working hard. I promise," Vince nodded. "I know you will that night." Deshaun sat at the kitchen table, his math textbook open in front of him. His mom was washing dishes, glancing over her shoulder at him every now and then. Deshaun was tired, his eyes heavy, but he was determined to finish his homework. He wasn't going to let himself fall behind. He owed it to himself and to his mom after an hour. He finally closed the book, letting out a long breath. He rubbed his eyes, feeling the exhaustion settle in his bones, but he felt a sense of satisfaction too. He was keeping up barely, but enough done for the night. His mom asked, drying her hands on a dish. "Towel? Yeah," Deshaun said, nodding. "I think I got most of it." She smiled, walked, looked over, and kissing the top of his head. "I'm proud of you, Dee. You're working so hard, but remember to take care of yourself." "Okay, I will, Mom," he promised, giving her a tired smile. She nodded, her eyes softening. "All right now. Go get some rest." Deshaun headed to his room, collapsing onto his bed. He stared up at the ceiling, his mind filled with thoughts of the shop, of school, of the truck he was working on with Vince. He knew it was a lot, it felt like too much sometimes, but he couldn't stop now. He was doing what he loved, and he was going to make it work, no matter how hard it got. He closed his eyes, letting himself drift off to sleep, ready to face whatever came next. The morning light filtered in through the window, waking Deshaun before his alarm went off. He blinked at the ceiling, the events of the last few weeks swirling in his mind like a fast-forwarded film reel. Today felt different, not because it was special, but because he felt like he'd come a long way. Even in such a short period, he got dressed quickly, pulling on his usual work clothes and grabbing his backpack. His mom was already in the kitchen fixing a quick breakfast. She turned when he entered, giving him a smile that seemed to be filled with both pride and concern. "Morning, Dee. You ready for another day?" she asked, placing a plate with a piece of toast in front of him. Deshaun smiled back, nodding. "Yeah, Mom, ready as ever." He took the toast, eating it quickly. "I think Vince said we'd be doing something big today, maybe even getting the truck started for the first time." His mom's face lit up. "That's amazing, Dee. You're doing such incredible things." There, Deshaun shrugged, a small grin on his face. "I'm just trying to learn. You know, one step at a time." "That's the spirit," she said, reaching over to ruffle his hair. And don't forget, keep those grades up too. He rolled his eyes with a playful smile. I know, as he headed out the door. Deshaun took a deep breath. He felt the chill in the air. It was one of those brisk fall mornings that seemed to wake him up fully, his senses sharp. He walked quickly, eager to get to the shop. When Deshaun arrived at the auto shop, he could see the familiar sight of cars lined up inside and the mechanics already at work. He pushed open the door, giving Maria a wave as he passed by the front desk. She waved back, calling out, "Good luck today, Dee." He grinned, nodding at her, before stepping through into the garage. Was there standing near the Mustang they had worked on before a clipboard. In his hand, he looked up when Deshaun entered, giving him a nod, morning. Kid, ready to finish up that truck? Vince asked, a twinkle in his eye. We're going to see if it'll roar back to life today. Deshaun's heart jumped. He'd been working on that truck for weeks now, stripping it down and rebuilding it bit by bit. The idea of finally seeing it run, it was more than just exciting. It felt like proof of everything he'd learned so far, definitely ready. Desa said, his voice filled with enthusiasm. Good, let him get started. Vince said, nodding toward the truck they spent the morning. Putting the final pieces together, Vince handed Deshaun tools, giving instructions on how to reconnect the hoses, double-check the wiring, and make sure everything was just right. The work was intense, but Deshaun loved it. Every bolt he tightened, every part he reattached. It felt like magic, like he was breathing life back into something that had been forgotten by lunchtime. They were ready. Vince stepped back, wiping his forehead with his sleeve, and gestured for Deshaun to do the honors. All right, Dad, you've been with this thing since we started. I think you should be the one to try it out. Deshaun's heart pounded as he moved around to the driver's side, opening the door and climbing in the seat creaked beneath him. As he settled in his hands, shaking slightly as he reached for the key, he looked over at Vince, who gave him a nod. Go ahead, kid. Let's see what you got. Deshaun swallowed, turning the key in the ignition for a moment. There was only silence, and then the engine sputtered. He held his breath, waiting, and then suddenly it roared to life, the sound filling the garage, echoing off the walls. It wasn't perfect. There was a slight cough, a hiccup, but it was running. It was alive. Deshaun let out a whoop of excitement, his face breaking into a wide grin. Vince laughed, clapping his hands together there. It is not bad, kid. Not bad at all. Deshaun climbed out of the truck, his hands still shaking from the excitement. Vince pulled him into a quick hug, giving him a firm pat on the back. You did good, D. Real good, Deshaun smiled, the pride swelling in his chest. Thanks, Vince. I couldn't have done it without you. Vince shook his head. Nah, don't sell yourself short. You've got a real talent. You've got what it takes. And that's what matters. The rest of the day passed in a blur. They continued working on the truck, fine-tuning things, getting it ready for delivery. Deshaun was exhausted by the time they finished, but it was the good kind of tired, the kind that came from working hard and seeing results. As he was packing up for the day, Vince called out to him, Hey, D, come here for a sec. Deshaun walked over, curious. Vince was standing by the workbench, a small envelope in his hand. He held it out and Deshaun took it, frowning slightly. What's this? He asked, open. It, Vince said, nodding toward the envelope. Deshaun tore it open, his eyes widening when he saw what was inside a paycheck, his first real paycheck. He stared at the amount, his heart pounding. It wasn't a lot, but it was more than enough to help his mom with the rent to make a difference. Vince, I don't know what to say. Deshaun stammered, looking up at him. Vince smiled. You earned it, kid. And if you keep working the way you have been, there's going to be more where that came from. Deshaun nodded, his throat tight. Thank you, really don't mention it, Vince said, giving him a nod. Now go home and get some rest you've earned. Deshaun walked home that evening, the sun dipping low in the sky, painting everything in a golden glow. He held the envelope tightly in his hand, his mind racing with thoughts of what he could do with it. He thought about his mom, how she'd smile when she saw it, how she'd finally be able to relax a little, at least for a while, when he got home. He found his mom in the kitchen, as usual, making dinner. She looked up when he walked in, eyes lighting up. "Hey, how was the shop today?" Deshawn smiled, holding up the envelope. "Mom, I got my first paycheck." Her eyes widened, and she quickly put down the spoon she was holding, coming over to him. She took the envelope, opening it carefully, her eyes filling with tears when she saw the amount. "Oh, Dee," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. This is amazing." He knotted his own throat tight. "I want you to use it for whatever we need, rent bills. Anything, I just want to help." She pulled him into a tight hug, her tears spilling onto his shoulder. "You're such a good boy. Your dad would be so proud of you." Deshawn hugged her back, closing his eyes. "I hope so, Mom. I really hope so." She pulled back, looking at him, her eyes filled with pride. "You're going to do great things. Dee, I know it." He smiled, nodding. "I'm going to try, Mom, one day at a time." That night, as Deshawn lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope, real, tangible hope. He had a job. He was learning, getting better, and he was finally able to help his mom. The way he'd always wanted to, he glanced over at the picture of his dad on the wall, the one next to his old toolbox. His dad's smile seemed to shine in the dim light, and Deshawn felt a swell of determination. He was on the right path. He was doing what he loved, and he was making a difference. And no matter how hard it got, no matter how many late nights and early mornings it took, he was going to keep going, because this was just the beginning.